I thought this would make a fascinating comparison, as both watches are of similar size and both are classed as luxury brands, even though Tudor are actually owned by Rolex. There is a lot of difference in price, although it could be argued the difference in specification and finishing isn't that different. Anyway, that's enough of this waffle, let's get on with it. So welcome to my head-to-head review between the Rolex Oyster Perpetual and the Tudor Black Bay 36. So let's start off with the dimensions before we start scoring. The Rolex has got a 36mm case, a lug width of 20mm, a depth of 11.5mm, a lug to lug of 44mm, and weighs about 118 grams after adjustment for my 17cm wrist. Moving on to the Tudor. Well, the Tudor's also got a 36mm case. It's got a lug width of 19mm, a depth of only 10.5mm, although it doesn't actually look any slimmer. A lug to lug of 43.5mm and weighs about the same as the Rolex. So brand. Both watches come under the Rolex flag, so let's be honest, Rolex have to win this one hands down. However, we mustn't forget, Tudor have earned a great reputation for supplying luxury branded watches at more affordable prices. So for the brand, the Oyster Perpetual gets 10 and the Black Bay 36 gets 8. Whilst the crowns are very different on the two watches, they are both beautifully made, both operate the movement perfectly and both engage like butter. Now the Rolex has got the in-house 3230 high beat movement. It's got a 70-hour power reserve. It's a chronometer certified movement and it's amazingly accurate. The downside is that the servicing costs are absolutely crazy. Now the Tudor is what they call the T800 movement, which in reality is a dressed up ETA 2824-2, however is a top grade and regulated to be as accurate as a chronometer, but without the certification. The power reserve is only 38 hours, but I feel for most people that isn't really an issue. The great thing about this movement is it is actually relatively inexpensive to service. It would be easy for me to give Rolex a much higher score, but I think taking everything into account, I'll just give it one additional point. So for the movement and crown, the Oyster Perpetual gets 10 and the Tudor Black Bay 36 gets 9. They both have flat sapphire crystals, but the Rolex has some AR coating. It's a shame Tudor didn't bother. The case on the Rolex is more rounded, giving the impression it's actually slimmer, whilst the Tudor has got slab sides. Of course, they are both beautifully executed, but I far prefer the Rolex case and will therefore give it 2 extra points. That said, I actually believe the light catcher cases on the Christopher Ward watches are even nicer. It's worth noting that whilst Rolex used 904L stainless steel, Tudor used 316. Now from what I can understand, 904 has a greater lustre whilst the 316 is more resistant to scratches. For these sort of prices, it would have been nice to see both brands apply an anti-scratch coating, but of course they didn't. So for the case and crystal, the Rolex OP gets 8 and the Tudor Black Bay gets 7. Onto the bracelet and the clasp. They both have brushed Oyster style bracelets that are extremely well made. They both fit beautifully to the case, but neither have quick release spring bars or drilled lugs. They do both have screw pins though for easy adjustment. Unfortunately, the Tudor has got a 19mm lug width, which may annoy some people, but as I have no intention on wearing it on a strap, it doesn't actually bother me. The clasps are extremely different though, although both are very good. I feel the quality of the Rolex clasp is probably better and it does have an on-the-fly half-link adjustment, but the Tudor clasp is a little more compact and 3 micro adjust will allow for more accurate fit. To be honest, I can't separate them. So equal scores for the bracelet and they both get 9. The dials are extremely different, as Rolex is definitely a sporty dress watch, whereas the Tudor is more of a dressy sports watch. From an aesthetical point of view, I find it hard to separate them, although I do tend to lean towards the Tudor. I definitely prefer the snowflake hands of the Tudor in comparison with the somewhat boring stick hands of the Rolex. It should be noted though, the Rolex indices are made of real white gold, which doesn't really add to the looks, but it's a great piece of one-upmanship. From what I can understand, Tudor gold plate their indices, but finding any firm evidence of this is almost impossible. Whilst the Tudor uses superluminova, Rolex use their own proprietary lume, chromolite. To be honest, I don't believe one is actually any better than the other. But for the record, let's have a look at the looms. So for the first time on this head-to-head, the Tudor comes out on top. The Rolex Oyster Perpetual gets an 8 and the Black Bay 36 gets a 9. This is an easy one. The Tudor has got 150 metres whilst the Rolex has got 100 metres. To be honest, 100 metres is enough to do what you realistically need to do. But I've got to give an extra point to the Tudor, haven't I? So for water resistance, the Rolex gets an 8 and the Tudor gets a 9. And here we are, Rolex's premium packaging with its very famous green box. And this is the Tudor packaging. It's quite generic, but as you'd expect, the quality is very good. Inside are the instructions and tags. So for presentation and packaging, the Oyster Perpetual gets a 9 and the Black Bay 36 gets a 7. So the X Factor. This is indeed an important category, but it's difficult to separate it from brand perception, which we have already covered. However, in this case, it's almost impossible to do that. The very fact you are wearing a Rolex can make you feel just that bit special, but to be honest, Tudor is no slouch either. I don't think it's going to surprise you, but this one's got to go to the Oyster Perpetual. So for this very important category, the X Factor, the Rolex Oyster Perpetual gets a 9 and the Tudor Black Bay 36 gets an 8. So value for money. Now this is the category I've most been dreading. You see, on the surface of things, the Tudor should win hands down, but the reality is that the residual value of the Rolex can arguably make it the best value for money watch available. They are both extremely well made watches. Both have their strengths. Both hit very different price points though. Again, I'm going to sit on the fence and give them the same score. I know there's going to be a lot of resistance to this, but when you take into account that Rolex should be worth more than I paid for it in 5 years' time, how can I ignore that? So value for money, they both get a 9. So in summary, I suppose it's of no great surprise that Rolex wins the day. And if I'm honest, I guessed it would before I started the project. They are both great watches, but perhaps more different than I first thought they would be when put side by side. In reality though, the choice is as much down to budget as it is taste. And that's what's going to make up most people's minds. Now that brings me to the end of this head-to-head review. If you enjoyed it, please click on the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, leave your comments below and enjoy the rest of your day.